with our speaker. We will be having a Q&A and discussion with our speaker. So if you have comments or questions from the Zoom room, write them in the chat, and Brian Link in the back will capture them, and he'll represent you with your question here. So what next in American politics? On to 2024. Raphael Sonenshein is the executive director of the Pat Brown Institute for Public Affairs at Cal State LA. And he's been a speaker with us before, and so I know many of you are here just to hear him, so we welcome you. He received his BA from Princeton and his PhD from Yale. Dr. Sonenshein is the author of 3 books on Los Angeles politics and government. He taught political science and public administration at Cal State Fullerton from 1982 to 2012, and he served as the executive director of the LA Charter Reform Commission and has advised numerous other municipal charter commissions. He was best educator and distinguished college faculty member at Cal State Fullerton and received a Wang Family Excellence Award. And he's also one of the 2 co-winners of the Haynes Foundation Research Impact Award. Again, we welcome you back as our speaker today. We're looking forward to this topic. I think we're all interested in what's ahead for 2024. Dr. Sonenshein, welcome back.
Thanks, good morning, everybody. I have a big, loud voice, and I want to make sure you can hear me. I used to teach a class of 220 students, and the students in the back, by the way, always thought I couldn't see what they were doing in the back row. Those of you who have been in universities know that the professor always knows what's happening in the back row, but I know you all will behave, so I'm really not worried about you guys. I'm going to talk to you for about half of the time and take Q&A the rest of the time. I imagine some of you might have a couple of questions about the state of the world that we're in right now. I always start by trying to do a little therapy for everybody about observing politics, by telling you how I observe politics. And I feel like I'm pretty knowledgeable about it, but I don't follow everything in politics, because if I did, I would probably have to go get professional help. There is so much intense stuff back and forth. The trick of following politics is to separate the signal from the noise, as they used to say. And 90% of it is noise. Things that are unverified, guesses, suppositions, people who say things they're not actually going to do and have never done and that no one has ever done, people who yell and scream, people who make accusations that don't pan out. I, therefore, am very careful. I don't watch very much cable news, for example. I only watch it when there's a crisis, because that's really what cable news was set up for. The rest of the time, they basically invent crises so that you will watch cable news. Stay tuned, because after the break, we have another crisis for you. I get nervous. I go on Twitter, but I'm doing it much less now because Twitter has become a little bit more like cable news. I read newspapers a lot. I read a lot of newspapers. When someone calls me and says, "Did you hear what happened?" I will immediately say, "Has it appeared yet in a major newspaper?" If it hasn't, just wait an hour and something else will happen. The point is, anxiety about politics is not very helpful. Concern about politics, however, is very helpful, because we're in the middle right now of a situation where American politics is not just American politics anymore. In fact, I would open by saying, to understand California politics, LA politics, what's happening in Washington, you have to understand what's happening in Kyiv. Because actually, what's going on is that American politics is now getting pulled into a worldwide political struggle that has been developing for about 15 or 20 years, but accelerated in the last few years, especially with the election of Barack Obama and Donald Trump, to become part of a worldwide contest that we haven't seen since the 1930s. Between democracy and authoritarian rule. And therefore, do you remember the old statement, politics stops at the water's edge? They used to say in the Cold War era that people kind of pull together for global stuff. Those days are over. because now the world is dividing into two camps, into the camps that favor democratic rule with a small d, democracy, and those that favor authoritarian rule. And it is a contest we don't know the result of, but one of the causes of it is the changing nature of the world and the countries that people live in. Populations migrating across European borders, by the way, is a much bigger issue than our immigration issue in the United States, believe it or not. It's changing politics. The changing roles of women in society are becoming a gigantic source of contest between authoritarian movements and democratic movements. You can usually, by the way, guess that on the authoritarian side, women don't have as many rights in countries where authoritarian rule comes in. Traditional values versus newer values, urban versus rural, which is becoming kind of a global phenomenon. So step outside American politics for a minute and then consider this. American political power is the great prize that these movements are contesting over. Because whoever controls the United States will have an outsized influence. We're the biggest, strongest power on the face of the earth. And therefore, foreign nations, foreign movements are playing in American politics in a way that's unprecedented. And American politicians are playing in the politics of other countries in order to support one side or the other. So now you will see democratic and political consultants flying off to Brazil, flying off to Germany, flying off to France, flying off to Japan to support opposing sides in their elections. And people in their countries are sending people here to try to influence Congress and to try to influence who becomes the president. And therefore, the battle over Ukraine is far more important and consequential than people realize. It's a little bit like Poland in 1939, in the sense that it's the canary in the mine of the clash between a rising authoritarian movement and traditional democracies, which are always slow to action, but I think ultimately prevail. But it always looks like they're going to lose until the last minute. Russia, a very weak power for a great power, has actually become the sort of world leader. Oh, stay closer to here? Okay. I tend to wander. I always think everything is Vegas. So basically, Russia has become kind of to some degree, the leader of some of these authoritarian movements, and they have played very successfully in American politics, especially in the 2016 election. They placed a pretty big bet, and that bet paid off with the election of Donald Trump. But then Trump's defeat brought a different regime into Washington, which is now strongly supportive of the Ukraine. Don't forget that one of the impeachments of Donald Trump was about his attempt to pressure Ukraine to intervene in the American election on his behalf by generating negative information on Joe Biden. So if that doesn't tell you that politics is no longer stopping at the water's edge, it is everywhere. So who wins in the Ukraine war is going to affect American politics to a great degree. It has caused a big divide in the Republican Party between the most conservative Republicans who don't support the Ukraine and mainstream Republicans who do, who are mostly in the Senate, and the first group is mostly in the House. So this is now the question about whether tanks get to the Ukraine. And it's led to all sorts of global challenges with Germany, which yesterday, by the way, backed down from its refusal to allow tanks, German-made tanks, to be shared with the Ukraine. Put it this way, when I read the news about Ukraine, I don't feel like I'm following a foreign situation just because it's interesting to learn about the rest of the world. I'm actually following American politics by following Ukraine. And I think you should too. I think it's the most significant physical thing happening in the world that would affect politics. Now, secondarily, American politics itself is on the knife's edge of two sorts of clashing worlds in this country that duplicates what we're finding throughout the world. One is a rising progressive movement of progressive values that really coalesced around Barack Obama's election in 2008. Drew heavily on urban residents, but also for the first time, Democrats began to draw well-educated suburban voters into the Democratic coalition, especially women. And on the Republican side, the reaction to that rising coalition led to the election of Donald Trump in 2016 with outsized, overwhelming support in rural areas. You know, rural voters used to vote Democratic in the New Deal, but not anymore. The worse rural areas are doing, the more likely they are to vote Republican, and Donald Trump eked out that victory in 2016. But now you see that we're going back and forth. It's almost like we're repeating the Trump-Obama election year after year after year. So the Democrats came back. Obama, of course, was reelected in 2012. Trump was elected in 2016, and Joe Biden was elected in 2020. Joe Biden has turned out to be the biggest surprise in about the last 30 years of American politics. And I have to tell you, I know you've all been around enough to see Joe Biden over the years. I have never seen a worse presidential candidate than Joe Biden until 2020. Something happened, you know, it's like watching somebody who's like tried something and tried something and tried something, and then finally it works, and that's Joe Biden. The first primary election Joe Biden ever won for president was near the end of the 2020 primaries when he won South Carolina. And he's gone on to be an immensely successful president with the most successful first 2 years of any Democrat since Lyndon Johnson, but without Lyndon Johnson's congressional majority. So therefore, Democrats who bore easily have decided he should not run again. Because after all, there's only two things that really bother Democrats: losing and winning. Bad news or good news. Democrats get bored with their presidents, usually in about the first couple of weeks of the new president, and look for a fresh face. I think this is, by the way, the worst idea in the world because there aren't that many fresh faces in politics. You want fresh faces? Go to the movies. Do politicians have fresh faces? Who won the most votes in modern American history? Richard Nixon. Big fresh face for you there, folks? So Democrats are now shopping around, and I just run around telling people, actually, don't shop around. The only person who has racked up this kind of set of victories since Lyndon Johnson is Joe Biden. Force him to run again. Serve as long as he's physically able. Anyway, but don't get me started on the boredom of Democrats with success. Now, that being said, we just had a congressional election, and it violated all the rules that we expected. First off, remember there was supposed to be a red wave. Red wave meaning that Republicans were going to sweep the country. There actually was a red wave, but only in some states. There was a blue wave in enough states for Democrats to hold the Senate, gain a seat, and on the Republican side, they barely won the House when they should have won 35 to 40 seats. They just won a few. So who was driving that wave? About 6 months ago, I got calls from reporters who asked me, would abortion be an issue in the election? And they asked me this after the Supreme Court decision. I was baffled by the question. I said, well, yeah, it's going to be the issue of the election. Then they asked me a great question. But don't you think it'll fade in a few weeks and then it will become about inflation and the cost of living? I said, yes, I guess what will happen is a lot of women in the United States will say, I was kind of concerned about abortion rights last week, but then I went to fill up my car with gas and found it had gone up 15 cents. They stopped for a minute and they said, I don't know, I can't bet on that. Well, as it turns out, it was the dominant issue of the election, and it continues to be the dominant issue in the country, because at the end of the day, that abortion decision is about the entire future of American life. I don't exaggerate when I say that. We live in a period where the issues that cut to the heart are more important than the ones that cut to the wallet. In the old days, it used to be inflation goes up, this happens, employment goes up, this happens, but now, same-sex marriage, rights for the LGBTQ community, the rights of women, how we talk about things, how we deal with each other as people are emerging as the fundamental issues of American politics. And the country is dividing on these things, and whole states are dividing on these things. And that's how I'm going to switch a little bit to California, Texas, and Florida. We're about to see a real test of the nature of the American Union, with a capital U, that we really haven't seen since the 1850s and 1860s. Because the Supreme Court, which in their infinite wisdom does not pay any attention to the consequences of their actions, have said every state can make their own rules on abortion as a result of this decision. And as they put it, there's nothing to worry about, because what could possibly go wrong? Well, what could possibly go wrong is that some states will have one set of rules and other states will have a completely different set of rules. And what did Abraham Lincoln say about a house divided against itself cannot stand, about the issue of slavery? It's going to become something where states have their own political identities. God help you if you are in the losing side of state politics for years going forward, AKA a Republican in a Democratic state, a Democrat in a Republican state. You are going to find the rules different on numerous things around matters that are vital to your life. I don't mean to, I told you at the start, don't get nervous. I'm telling you the stuff to actually get nervous about. Don't worry about the story of the day, except tragedies like Monterey Park. That's a real story. But don't get into all the ups and downs of all the things that are going on. But keep in mind that Republicans in the House would like to pass a national ban on abortion. They'll never pass the Senate. It won't get signed by the president. It's not out of the question that the Supreme Court would make a decision like that, because that's actually more consistent with their so far decision that basically there is no right to have abortion in this country. Short of that, California will have one set of rules, and Florida and Texas, the two biggest states who are the adversaries politically of California, will have their rules. And we may see a presidential election between a governor of California and a governor of either Florida or Texas. I don't know that it'll happen in 2024, but I think it's very likely to happen in 2028. States are going to have to start making some pretty scary decisions. If you are in a state that bans abortion, and you are right now able to leave that state and go to California or another state, but I believe states are going to begin passing laws making it difficult for you to do that. What's going to happen at that point? Is California going to send hostage rescue people to Texas and Florida? Are Texas and Florida going to demand the extradition of people from California? The point is that that path is already you could actually see that happening. Now, I do not think we are going to have a civil war in the United States. It's an overused term. And one reason is the contending states don't border each other the way the South did from the rest of the country. You could have a war between the South and the rest of the country. But we are going to have a conflict that's going to go on for a very long time. And what I tell my young students and my kids and others is, when somebody tells you this is the most important election of your lifetime, it's true, and so will the next one. Because they say, didn't you tell me last time it was the most important election of your lifetime? I said, yeah, this one is too. Because these elections are all going to be consequential. And what's the result of consequential elections? High turnout. High turnout. You know what the most high turnout in the history of Los Angeles elections ever was? 1969, Tom Bradley against Sam Yorty. Turnout was 76% of registered voters. In other words, when everything feels like it's at stake, people turn out, and American voting turnout is exploding. And what's really startling is it's exploding among young voters. Remember the old thing, young people don't vote? That's actually not true anymore. They don't vote as much as older voters, but they vote at a way higher level than they did before. And they're reporting issues like climate change, abortion rights, social issues are driving their vote. Older voters are beginning to report for the first time that the survival of democracy is a key voting idea for older voters. Everybody's a little shocked that democracy's on the table. You know, I think the shock of January 6th really is still being absorbed, how close that came. By the way, that was a much closer call than people realize to how that could have ended up. I think we actually dodged quite a bit on that. Young voters are turning out, but what's going to determine, my guess, the nature of American politics, me being a political scientist, are the political attitudes of college-educated white women. And the second group are African-American women. Those two groups, the second knows what they want and are now going after it. The first group is in play between the two political parties, college-educated white women. Democrats have been increasingly winning the votes of college-educated white women who live in suburbs outside urban areas, but not women who live in suburban areas but not near urban areas. It all depends who you identify with. Do you feel yourself part of a cosmopolitan metropolis or closer to a surrounding rural area? This is the battleground right now, is for Democrats to keep motivating African-American women who are the reason Joe Biden got elected president. At the very least, the reason he got nominated for president. I tell people what really happened in the Democratic Party in 2020. Democrats were doing what Democrats like to do, which is they were shopping at the mall. They liked Pete, they liked this one, they liked that one. Every day they would change their minds. Black voters had one choice from day one, which is whoever can beat Donald Trump. I don't care if they're fun, I don't care if they're good looking, I don't care if they're young, I don't care if they're old, I don't care what they are. And they settled on Joe Biden about halfway through and waited for the South Carolina primary, which has the largest black vote. And then they shut down the shopping excursion. Probably saved the Democratic Party that they did that. Don't think Joe Biden doesn't know that, and that has a lot to do with a lot of the appointments he's made to courts and other places. They just said, we've had it with your chasing around all these candidates. He won South Carolina, then won California, finished it up, and then won the election. To win those college-educated white women, however, they are the one group in the country that is completely up for grabs. College education now leans people toward the Democrats. When I was a kid, it leaned people toward the Republicans. The Republicans were a more traditional party than they are today. But social issues are connected through higher education. Higher education, you're more likely to support gay rights, you're more likely to support abortion rights. But white women have also been pulled loyal to the Republican Party, but now are going back and forth depending on the candidates, and Democrats believe they are gettable. And in our divided country right now, you don't need to get a lot of them. You need to get enough of them. By the way, the people you're not going to move, are the people that the media goes to interview in Ohio bars. Men, middle-aged men who are kind of mad about everything. And you say, so, you still like mad? And they go, yeah. Go interview college-educated white women and interview black women, and you'll find out where the country's going. And then do something really crazy. Don't ask people why they don't vote. Ask them why they did vote. And that means you go talk to young people and find out what is driving their situation. So California is going to become a big player in this non-Civil War Civil War that's going to be happening between the states. And California rather than New York. California is in much better shape politically to fight that than New York State is, but that's a whole other topic. I'm from New York, and I can tell you why New York is a mess. Even though I still root for the Yankees, I root for the football Giants, but politically, I don't think so. And that takes us all the way down to Los Angeles, because I told you I was going to take a tour from the Ukraine to Los Angeles. Los Angeles is going through a similar type of transformation, but it's within the Democratic Party, because Los Angeles is an overwhelmingly Democratic city. LA City Hall is a pretty interesting place right now. Interesting is putting it mildly. I've actually created a little chart that I haven't quite finished yet, showing the 15 seats on the city council, who got bumped, who's out, who's in, who's new, who's old. I have to put a hold on it, because I think there's a few more seats that are maybe still going to float around. LA has elected a new mayor, Karen Bass, who is an African-American woman who's been in LA politics forever, even though she's been a member of Congress, a member of the Assembly. There's a whole new group of people coming into the city council who have never been in government before. People getting citywide offices, like the city controller is a young guy who has never been in public office before. The winds of change are happening in Los Angeles. How did Karen Bass get elected? If you remember the movie Back to the Future, she got elected by reconstructing the Tom Bradley coalition from 1973, which I never thought, which I had studied that coalition for years, I never thought that coalition would come back. And that's a coalition of African Americans and white liberal voters, including a large proportion of Jewish voters. That was Karen Bass's coalition. Karen Bass is a graduate of Hamilton High School, where she grew up and went to school with a lot of Jewish kids. She was really well known and well liked in the Jewish community. And she beat someone who spent $100 million against her. And I don't know if you realize what it's like when somebody spends $100 million against you. Have you considered what that is? That person never has to make any tough choices. By the way, and Caruso ran a very good campaign with his $100 million. But they could go to Rick and say, should we do mailings? Should we go door to door? Should we go on TV? Should we do big events? And he could say, yes. Most candidates say we can do this one, but we can't do this one. Meanwhile, Karen Bass had to hoard her dollars and couldn't do a whole lot of things. But she's the only person in Los Angeles who could have beaten Rick Caruso, in my view. He wiped out everybody else. He would have defeated any other candidate. He was that good a candidate. But she just had a reputation and a strength that reminded me of Tom Bradley. So now she is mayor, and all she has to do is a couple of little things. One is fix homelessness. And of course, in a Democratic town, people say, we're going to give you all the time in the world. How's Friday? I think she may get there, but it's going to take a couple of years. But she declared a homeless emergency, gives her extra power. Meanwhile, life intrudes, and suddenly she has to decide on the reappointment of the police chief out of nowhere, because his term ran out. Right at the moment that she comes in as mayor, he applies for reappointment, and she has to sort of say what she thinks about that. You got to do that. Meanwhile, other stuff happens that gets in the way, but if she can keep her focus on homelessness, I think she'll be very, very successful as a mayor. But she's a remarkable person. I wouldn't describe her as a dynamic speaker. I would also say I worked for Tom Bradley, who was also not a dynamic speaker. But when Tom Bradley was speaking, he was always Tom Bradley. And those of you who knew him or remember him from his days in LA, his impression was always one of great strength and integrity everywhere he went. He didn't have to give a good speech. In fact, I don't know that I ever heard him give a good speech. But I always saw him respected and well regarded in the community. That's going to be her selling point. Her selling point is being her. Isn't that a funny thing to say about people in politics when you're always telling them, whatever you do, I have only one bit of advice to give you. Do not be yourself. Under any circumstances, there's a better you that we can help you design and communicate. I mean, I think that's pretty bad advice, by the way, that people get all the time. Karen Bass is Karen Bass, and we'll see how she goes. Long story short, and to conclude a little bit, where we are in LA used to be an outpost of politics. Nobody paid attention to it. When I was in graduate school, I started studying LA politics, and my colleagues and friends and associates would say, why don't you study a real city with actual politics like and New York, the only two cities that really matter, because the East Coast rules. The East Coast is everything. Well, Los Angeles was the stepchild of all this, but in recent years, California and LA have become major political forces in American politics. So Karen Bass could say in the campaign, if I'm elected, I'm going to call Joe Biden. And what she said to him is he said, we're going to cut homelessness in this country by 25%. So she called Joe Biden and said, I have an idea. Just give us enough money to fix it in LA, and that's more than 25% of homelessness will solve the problem for you. They might actually do that. So LA now is in a position to go to Washington and ask for real help. And LA political figures become big political figures. When I moved to LA in 1974, people would run for the state assembly because someday they might be able to run for governor or senator. Now they run for the state assembly on the possibility that a city council seat might open up in the city of Los Angeles. That's a gigantic change. So she's running a city that, for better or worse, is now globally noticed, serious, and important. And that may be the reason that we're able someday to solve the problem of homelessness, which I have to tell you is a problem of staggering complexity. And the mayor said something the other day that I was a little shocked by the kind of boldness and honesty of it. She said, no matter how much housing we build, we're not going to be able to solve homelessness unless we think of mental health. Unless we think of mental health and mental illness. Now, everybody wants a single solution. So there's the one camp that says everybody on the streets is mentally ill, that's what you've got to do. And you've got others who say everybody's ready for housing, we just have to build the housing. And what she's saying is, folks, let's get honest about this. We don't know for sure how many are which. Some are both, some are one, some are the other. All hands on deck, which means getting LA County involved, bringing them in, which looks like it's a fascinating thing when I show my students pictures of the LA County Board of Supervisors. What stands out? 5 women, reminding me of what Ruth Bader Ginsburg said when she was asked what would be the ideal number of women on the Supreme Court. She said 9. The point is, why not? So you've got a woman mayor of LA City, the 5 supervisors of LA County, and they're finally, the city and county are finally for once sitting down to talk about homelessness. Problem solving, that's very hopeful. But do I think it's going to be done by Friday? I think in 2 years, if it's been cut in half, that would be a really big deal. And we tend as voters to reward leaders who put us in the right direction. We don't always get mad that it doesn't happen right away. So anyway, let's just summarize, and I'd like to take some of your questions. Everything going on in the world affects our politics. and our politics affects everything going on in the world. One last thought before I take, can I have one more minute? As my mother used to say, is it good for the Jews? The Jewish community is in the middle of this for many reasons, because the contending forces in American politics, it pulls in the politics of Israel, which is both an issue for American Jews, and American Jews are an issue in Israeli politics, and Israel is an issue in American politics and Jewish politics. Because now Israeli elections generate responses from the political parties in the United States, right versus left, and American Jews lean heavily Democratic, and one of the most favorable countries in public opinion toward Donald Trump was Israel. And yet, Israel stands on the Democratic side with a small d as the leading actual working democracy in the Middle East, which now has a very, very conservative government, which creates issues for the American administration. And the truth of the matter is there's two Jewish communities that are fraternal, together, Israeli Jews and American Jews, but may not have to agree to disagree about certain aspects of American politics with regard to Israel. This is going to be a very interesting thing for years going forward. And finally, lastly, this community is overwhelmingly concerned about the rise of anti-Semitism in the United States and throughout the world. And there's two kinds of anti-Semitism that American Jews are concerned about. One from the right, which seems to be a direct physical threat against Jews, and the reasons we have security guards is not coming from the left, but the other, the concern from the left of overstated critiques of Israel beyond just Israel's policies, and wondering whether at that point that can be interpreted as a kind of anti-Semitism, is a lively debate in the Jewish community. The point is, Jews aren't feeling too secure right now in the United States. And our own polling on this shows a big jump, and other polling is showing it, about fears of anti-Semitism. That is worth worrying about. That's not one of these epiphenomena that I said you should ignore on cable news. That's a real deal. I'm going to stop there and take some questions. How's that?
Hey, thank you. Lauren?
I could ask you a whole lot
Hi,
of
everybody. Can I just wave at everybody first? Hi, everybody. Nice seeing you all online. Hope everybody's fine. Okay, thank you. Okay.
I could ask you a lot of questions. I was going to start with Ukraine, but I'm going to go to something more fundamental. It seems to be, it could be argued, that the Constitution, which was a marvelous document when it was begun, and the corresponding Bill of Rights, is so out of date without any chance of fixing it that we've created, in a sense, the ability for a tyranny of the minority, and I'm not sure how that gets changed. Simple example, you can vote for the one person who got the most votes as president, doesn't win, that's not going to change because of the foundation. And the other one is, I've heard people contend that we are basically becoming a socialist country as we solve these problems. Democratic socialist, but socialist nonetheless. And you just look at where they're trying to make the differences. And as one last tag on, it befuddles me that people who are working class people, men, women, I don't care, they don't understand that when the Republicans talk about getting rid of Medicare and Social Security, that's a real possibility, and they either don't know or don't care.
Okay, so make sure everybody knows. The first question is about, is our Constitution out of date? It allows what you might call minority rule, which, in other words, you could lose the presidential election popular vote and become president. It's happened a bunch of times in previous elections. The US Senate is a completely undemocratic institution, and it's extremely hard to change because you need the ratification of 3/4 of the states when the states hate each other. So the odds are any change will be opposed by the other side enough to be more than a quarter. The second one, maybe if I could just quickly shorten it, is why do a lot of working class voters, quote, vote against their interests? That I'll comment on separately. The Constitution is completely out of date. I guess at the end of the day, I think changing the Constitution is more dangerous right now than trying to somehow live with the Constitution we have, because the changes that people will propose, say in a new constitutional convention, it would all depend who controls the convention. And if it's one side or the other in our current debates, God help us, it's really a problem. We've been dealing with it for 200 and decades, years, decades. It's just unbelievable. We've learned to adapt a lot, and what still turns out to be true, though, if the public really supports something, it will eventually happen, even with our screwed up system of obstacles. If the public supports something, it will truly happen. If the public opposes something, it will ultimately not happen. And that's why the bans on abortion, in my view, will ultimately fail, regardless of the Constitution. The public opinion still ends up ruling. As to whether people pursue their own interests or not, one thing to keep in mind is most people don't pay any attention at all to politics. So if you ran a focus group and put 50 voters in there and said, how could you vote for someone who's going to get rid of Social Security and Medicare? They'll say two things. One is, that's not true. And the other is, nobody would ever do that, so let's not keep talking about that. And then when somebody actually does it, they don't know who actually did it. So it's not, unfortunately, like people pull out a piece of paper and say, here's what I would like to have happen. Who's for it? Who's against it? Politics has to be able to let people see the choices. Let me give you a quick clue about turnout. Among young voters, young voter turnout was highest in those states that had consequential elections in the states where people could see the differences that you're talking about. In the other states, their turnout was as bad as ever. This is the work of all of us, which is to tell people what's really happening. Okay.
Who has a question? Let's on over here.
Going to your point about what's good for the Jews, do you see the abortion dispute morphing or transitioning into a religious freedom question? And if it does, how does that impact the Jews?
You know, the question is, given talking about Jewish voting, could this someday morph into a religious freedom issue? It depends against all possibilities that the Supreme Court has like a sense of humor. Because what the Supreme Court has begun saying is, you can change a policy based on your religious beliefs. But they seem to be mostly interested in that being evangelical white Christians' beliefs. But what happens when you discover that the most pro-choice group in the United States are Jewish women? Number one, in the whole country, it's been true for years. People are talking and starting to file suits saying, this is a violation of my religious beliefs that there's a ban on abortion. And when that gets up to the Supreme Court, which has several Jewish members, but they've been outvoted in recent things, it'll just be interesting to see how they deal with it. Now, if they really had a sense of humor, there are witches filing lawsuits now saying my religious freedom. In other words, you could turn it into absurdity, but if the Jewish community files lawsuits, it won't be a joke. I mean, it could potentially be argued that but do we really want to go down the road? See, we're going down the wrong road, which is a country that has separated church and state, saying, okay, so we did it for this group, now I guess we got to do it for everybody. And before you know it, it's probably simpler to not have religious tests at all, which the Constitution pretty much makes clear you're not supposed to do that. But we'll see. Oh, great.
Hi, there's actually another abortion-related question from the Zoom, and I'll just read it here. I don't believe that anti-abortionists are motivated by either religion or morals, despite their claims. What are their real motivations?
Okay, I'll repeat the question. The questioner asserts that those who oppose abortion are not really doing it on, let's say, on a moral basis. What is their real reason? I don't do very well speculating about why people believe the things they believe. I think there is a very strong proportion of people who do fundamentally oppose abortion on religious grounds. But that same group is divided into two groups. The first group takes that as saying no one should be able to have the choice. There is a very, very large second group which says, I oppose abortion on moral grounds, but I do not believe that people should lose reproductive choice. So in other words, that second group is not going to vote against a candidate who is pro-choice, and the first one will. You could argue that so much of the abortion debate, especially in red states, is about the role of women in society and what people consider the right role and the not right role. I don't dig too much into people's brains, though, as to why. I generally assume people have beliefs that I may not agree with, but I tend to think those are their beliefs. And maybe the political leaders have a strategy, but I'm not always sure that the person, the voter, has anything other than their own beliefs.
I have a question. You talked about, we should not pay attention, we should get our information from newspapers. But social media is basically where most people are getting their information, which is driving a lot of conspiracy theories and creating an echo chamber of that. We have representatives who were willing to vote to overturn an election. It seems crazy. So, what is going to happen, or how do we get through this so that, rational voices may survive?
Okay, politics, rational. I just want to see if I can fit those into the same boat. Politics is about emotion.
And conspiracy.
Right,
theories.
but politics is about emotion. And it is incumbent on people who believe they're paying attention to the facts to think of themselves as teachers, not lecturers, but teachers. And teachers who help people come to see those facts in a credible way. And that's a conversation that we should all be having with people, although when people are deep in the rabbit hole of conspiracy, don't waste your time. But a lot of people are just kind of flirting with it. Social media is also an incredibly good way to keep up with newspapers. If you can't subscribe to every newspaper, you'll be able to get feeds of their stories on social media. I'm just finding Twitter, ever since Elon Musk got it, to be kind of like going to a restaurant where I used to get bagels and lox in the morning and everybody was sitting and talking and learning, and suddenly 100 people wandered in who are screaming in my ear crazy stuff. And I realized that's probably not healthy for me, so I'm just not using it anymore. You have to think about it with young people, and I try to teach young people how to follow the news, but roll with the fact that they're on social media. Don't lecture them that it's bad. Remember the old days when you had 3 networks? Who cares? About 2, 4, and 7 in the old days. No, this is where we are. But I did have an experience with one of my daughters at one point when I did lecture a little bit, which was very unfortunate. I said, you're on your phone. How do you know what's going on? She showed me her phone. She was reading the New York Times. Well, it told me something. Don't ever assume what anybody's doing because of the physical vehicle they're using to access information. But look, at the end of the day, somebody once said, lies spread around the world before the truth even puts their pants on. I think it was Winston Churchill. It goes back to the 1930s. Authoritarian movements thrive on lies. But some of the conspiracies are going to be true. There's no Area 51 with space aliens, but there are things that may be true. But give it time. Weigh the evidence, but train people how to navigate this world, and don't believe the first thing you hear. The first thing you hear is probably not true.
Did you have a question?
Yes. Is there going to be a demographic inevitability of change? Because what's happening, you look at Florida, probably the median age is 107, I don't know what it is. But those people are going to be gone. And there'll be a whole wave of young people with very, very different point of view. And is that demographic inevitability going to make a change in this country?
That's a great question, because when Barack Obama was elected in 2008, Democrats said demography is destiny because they assumed it would happen automatically. And then they lost Congress in 2010. because it turned out that demography only gets you part of the way. You also have to recruit people in these communities as they come in, maybe younger folks. Older folks may be changing their orientation if Medicare and Social Security are in the debate about the debt limit starting this week. That message will get through. The other thing is young people become older people. And what we're looking at right now is trying to understand what happens to generations politically as they age. But what's interesting about Florida is Florida 20 years ago was a competitive state. Remember the recount of 2000? It is not a competitive state right now. The Democratic Party has collapsed completely in Florida. They're not even competing seriously anymore. Just the way California went the other direction where the Republican Party has collapsed completely. And the Democrats completely rule. Older folks will be replaced by a new generation coming up, but that generation may change as they get older. A lot we just don't know. In other words, demography is the beginning of destiny, but destiny is also about politics and how you're able to shape the different communities.
This is a little off, not exactly what you were saying, but as a third generation San Franciscan, where San Francisco was the place to be in California, did it get to be so liberal that it was no longer in contention, or what happened?
Well, I love that question. You know, how come San Francisco is not the place to be anymore in California? Is it because San Francisco became more liberal? Actually, San Francisco is becoming pretty conservative right now compared to LA. The real difference is LA finally got up on its 2 feet and really grew up and became a big political community, changed election dates to even-numbered years, which brought more renters into the electorate, brought younger people in. LA is just a more interesting place. Look at the food scene alone. My friends in New York are willing to admit that the best pastrami sandwiches in this country are in LA, not New York. Do you know what that costs them to say that? The New York Times used to send reporters out here to write articles about what superficial yahoos we are, and then they'd go back to New York on Monday. They'd fly in on Saturday, go to a superficial party in Beverly Hills, and then go home and write a terrible article. Now the New York Times has a bureau of reporters who are first-rate reporters who do serious reporting about LA politics. And what that has meant is the weight of LA in California politics has finally now reflected its numbers in California, whereas San Francisco used to run the Democratic Party in California, now LA does. So I'm excited about that because I prefer LA. Well, he's got the con, as they say.
The last question.
Your optimism is wonderful. I really feel very uplifted. On the dark side, I'm concerned about the quality of candidates and the quality of voters. I read Washington's farewell address and went into a deep depression. And my question to you is, do you think that there is a sexy way or way to make politics sexy in our curriculum? Because we're teaching pretty much everything but that. And these are the people we're all talking about. We're depending on them for our future. So what can you say about that?
Okay, since this is the last question, great time to decide whether to be optimistic or pessimistic. Worried about the quality of candidates and the quality of voters. First of all, this is going to sound very counterintuitive. The quality of political candidates today is about 1,000 times higher than it was when I was a kid. I grew up on the East Coast, which was machine politics, where hacks were everywhere. You know, the person who rises up through the party. And occasionally you'd get a John F. Kennedy, and people would be pretty excited, or you'd get, you know, somebody, just a Woodrow Wilson, or the now discredited Woodrow Wilson, but back then, you know, the president of Princeton University. Our candidates are better educated, smarter, more interested in public policy, and the voters are actually probably better prepared than ever before, but the mismatch is the word sexy that you raised, which makes me think about the fact we're only now starting to learn that people don't vote because somebody gives them a list of thoughtful public policies and tells them that this is an important public issue that you should pay attention to. People vote, and this is the one great thing about old-fashioned politics that we've forgotten. If it doesn't matter to them, their minds will be closed and they'll go do something else. That doesn't mean they're stupid. What it means is we're all very busy and we put our time into things that matter to us. If there's a recall of the car we drive and it says the brakes don't work, they don't have to send us a letter to bring our car in, right? We spent too much time trying to make our voters into participants in public policy conferences. The real thing is this: what matters to you? And when you take a community that hasn't voted and there's a chemical plant that is making kids sick in that neighborhood, you call a community meeting, there'll be 300 people there and they'll be mad as hornets, and something will happen. We should always be thinking about how to make politics wildly, crazily lively. You ever see Katie Porter's whiteboard? You know, she's in the House, she's running for the Senate. She has this big whiteboard and she makes corporate leaders testify, and then she asks them questions and she writes their idiotic answer up there. Henry Waxman used to do that. Now that's how you tell a story. You don't get up there and give a lecture. Again, to me, this is all about teaching each other, teaching ourselves, learning, and none of it's about lecturing or making people better. Find where people are and show them what matters. And if we do that, democracy is going to be just fine in the United States.
Thank you very much, Professor Sonenshein. Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you for having me.
No, we really appreciate your joining us, and hopefully we will see you back with us again in the next year or two. We really appreciate it. We learned a lot today. Really appreciate that. Okay, you have a day job? Okay, all right. Well, we're going to take about a 10-minute break.